Hello everyone, as you can see in the video, today we'll be going over how to do a vaulting system which will detect the object it has in front, the height of the object, the width of the object, and the angle at which the character hits the object. It will also check in case you have any obstacles above your head that don't allow enough space for the character to go through. The function is called with the space button. If it doesn't find any object to vault, it will simply just do a jump, as you can see. So if the obstacle is too thick, too high, or there's an obstacle above your head, he will simply jump as if nothing happened. So just to do a bit of an overview, in order to create this system, we implemented a plugin, Motion Warping, which Unreal Engine already has. We created 3 new functions with a series of variables, and so the first thing we're doing is once we press jump, we're going to use the object location function, which will basically do a capsule trace by channel. The trace will start where the actor location is, a bit lower, and it will finish 200 units in front of him. Out of the hit, we want 2 variables, the impact point to know where the obstacle is, and the impact normal, because then we're going to compare angles to see if the character is facing the obstacle or not. Once this is done, we go to our second function, which is object dimensions. Here we're going to get the height of the object, which is this first part. We're going to do a for loop with break. This will basically shoot up sphere traces up the obstacle to determine the height. We're using the variable we just promoted before, and we're doing it, and the line trace is 75 units long. Every time we hit the obstacle, we're going to update this variable, which is the impact point. That way we can get the height. Once we stop hitting it, we're going to do a check. And we're going to check if there's an obstacle above the character's head that wouldn't allow him to jump over the obstacle. If there is no obstacle, then we continue. Once this is broken or it's finished and completed, we're going to check how wide the obstacle is. A series of calculations. We're going to do a series of sphere traces vertically that will determine how wide the object is. Here we also want to promote the impact point to a variable. After these 2 things have done, we're going to do a series of checks. The first one is using the impact normal we got before. We're going to check if the character is looking at the obstacle. If he is, then we can proceed. Then we're going to check how high the obstacle is, and if it's less than a certain height, we continue. And finally, we're going to check if the obstacle is narrow enough for the player to be able to vault. Of course, we're also going to check if there was an obstacle, which is this variable here. If there's no obstacle and everything else is true, we are vaulting, and we set up the motion warping positions. The location is going to come off from the object height and the object depth we got from before. These numbers depend on what the animation is going to be and where you want to position your character. We also want to get the actor rotation, so he keeps the same orientation he was before. This will call a custom event we've created in the event graph, just below the jump action button, where we're setting the character movement to flying, removing the collision from the capsule component, and playing a montage. The montage comes from an animation we have previously made with the by editing in the sequencer. So the animation we're gonna make ourselves, and the one I used to make, I just made a copy of the run forward, edited it, and used it as the montage. So back to where we were. The montage itself has two notifiers. One is the motion warping window, which means this is the amount of time the animation has to get to the point I established here, so this point, or this location. And the second notifier will reset the movement and collision of the character. So on notify begin, we're going to reset the character movement falling and set the collision back. And this is basically it. So let me show you how I did it. The first thing I want to do is start with a third-person template, clean up the map a bit, and put a couple of obstacles of different heights so I can test the system out. First thing I want to do is open the third-person blueprint and check the animations the mannequin has by default, since we will be creating our own from the base animation of running. And I'm gonna use the running animation, duplicate it, and we're gonna edit that one into a vaulting animation. Once you open the animation copy, we want to go to the top right where it says edit in sequencer and bake to control rig. And by default, the control rig will be positioned on the 0, coordinates of your map. So I'm just gonna move it here next to the wall so I can visualize the animation while I'm doing it. I want to change the FPS of the animations, so it has 60. We also want to use the IK rig, which means that if you move a bone, the rest of the bones connected to it will move in a realistic way. So you want to select all the global keyframes, click on the arrow, and then select all of this so it's on. You want to click on the key icon on top, which will allow the sequencer to create keyframes every time we move a bone to a different position. I'm gonna speed up things a bit from here. Another thing is you don't have to go through every single keyframe. If you delete the keys between, for example, frame 15 and frame 20, the sequencer will fill out those gaps for you. As you can see, I have a lot of empty spaces, but the sequencer just fills in the animation as we go along. Once you have something you're happy with, save it and close it. We don't need it anymore. The next thing we need is to install the motion warping plugin Unreal Engine has. This will require a restart of the engine. Once you've restarted the engine, close the plugins tab and we'll continue with the code. Before we go with the code, we need to do some things to the animation we just created. Like, for example, deleting all the frames we don't need. We also need to enable root motion. So on the left, on the asset details, we'll have to enable root motion and remove force root lock. So since we want to use the same button to detect obstacles as to jump, we're going to have to first create the function that will allow the player to detect if there's an obstacle in front of him. The first thing we'll do is a capsule trace by channel. This will basically shoot out a capsule from the character in front of him by the amount we want and see if it hits something. We want to get the actor location. I am subtracting here just a few units of the set coordinate, so it starts a bit lower, but it's not really necessary. I also want to know the get actor rotation, so we can get the forward vector from that, in order for the line trace to shoot forward from the actor. And you want to multiply it by the amount of units you want the line trace to go forward. So in this case, I'm going to put 300, but I think further along the video, I'll be switching it to 200, since I think 300 is a bit too far away from for the player to already be doing the volt animation. So radius and half height you can put wherever you want, as long as it's big enough for the trace to detect the obstacles in front of it. Then we need to do a branch, detect if we hit something, and out of the hit values we're going to break hit result, and we're interested in two variables. One of them is going to be the impact point, that way we know where the object is, and the other one is the impact normal, since later on we're going to want to compare the normal of the object to the angle at which the character is facing it, in order to do the animation or not. We want to promote both vectors to variables so we can access them further on. As you can see, it starts quite low, so we'll detect any obstacles that are from the feet up to his chest, more or less. Now we will create the function to determine the height and width of the obstacle. So the first thing we want to create is a for loop with break. First index will be 1 and last index will be 200 right now, but you can change it depending on your needs and the obstacles that it will have to measure. So it will basically do the for loop 200 times. We want to promote the index to a variable so we can use later on. This basically means we're going to do a sphere trace by channel 200 times. So the way this works is that we will use the initial impact point that we promoted in the object location function, and from there we're going to do a series of trace channels upwards until it doesn't hit the obstacle anymore, therefore knowing how high the object is. So this calculation basically means the starting point will always be higher each time it does the sphere trace by channel, but the direction will be forward from the actor. We also want to check if we hit something, and from the hit break the hit result. As in the object location, here we want to promote the impact point to know the height of the obstacle. We want to test it out now, so we have to put the object dimensions function at the end of the object location function. As you can see, the line trace works nicely. Since there's way too many line traces, I think we can reduce the number to 100. This part of the code will determine the height of the obstacle in front of the player. The number the object height index is multiplied by is the frequency, or basically the space, between each sphere trace by channel. So if you wanted to be more accurate, the lower the number. If you don't care that much about having the exact spot where the object finishes, you can put maybe a 10 or a 5 or something even larger. From here we're also gonna check if there's any obstacle above our head for the character to be able to fit through the space. To check if there's an obstacle above us, we want to create a sphere trace by channel, where the start of the trace will be right above the object height, and the end of the trace will be a number that you determine. So how big does the space need to be for the character to be able to pass through it? We also want to do a branch here, and if it doesn't hit anything, then we can go ahead and break the for loop with break. We need to set some variables here, but I don't do it until later, so don't worry about it for now. As you can see, it's doing several traces by channel. This is because I should have connected it to the false link from the previous branch. Now it should only do one trace, but the trace starts too low, therefore already hitting the obstacle we're trying to jump by. So I'm going to increase the number of offset value for the start position. So basically now we can identify where the object is, we can see how high it is, and we can check for an obstacle above our heads. Now that we have the height and we can check for obstacles above our head, we can then check what the width of the object is. So the structure for this part is going to be more or less the same. We're also going to use the sphere trace by channel. We want to also promote this index to a variable because we're going to use it in the calculations. First index and last index will be the same, but the calculations are a bit different, since this time we want the line trace to be vertical and go forward from the player. Now we have a series of line traces going up and a series of line traces going down. Again, here you can play with the numbers depending on what your needs are. Here we're also going to promote the impact point to a variable. And once we don't hit anything, we're going to break the for loop. And on completed, we're going to do a series of checks for the player, so the player can know if he's supposed to do the animation or not. So the first check we're going to do is to compare the angle at which the character is looking at the object. So for this, we're going to need the actor rotation, delta rotator to compare the angles, and we're going to use one of the variables we had promoted before, the impact normal, and make a rot from said. We're only interested in the return value of said. So if this value is greater or equal or lesser or equal than a certain number, we will do the animation. Otherwise, we interpret that the character is not facing that obstacle and therefore doesn't want to do the animation. The next check we want to do is how much distance is there between the feet of the player and the height of the obstacle. This way we can filter out which obstacles we want the character to be able to climb versus the ones that he shouldn't be able to climb. here I make a mistake and the variable should be lesser than, not greater than. So if the character is looking away from the obstacle, it won't be able to vault, but if it's looking within a certain range, he will be able to vault it. So the next step, I wanted to create an obstacle that's above from ground level. That way I can check if the calculations for the height of the obstacle are correct and will always work, no matter if you're at ground level or on top of an obstacle. This is what I was referring to as before when I said I hadn't done a mistake. Instead of greater than, it should have been a less than, which I correct now. To check the width of the obstacle, we're going to need the variable that we promoted earlier and the object height. This number is how wide the object can be for the character to still be able to vault it. While creating the is the obstacle too wide to vault condition, I made a mistake. We're gonna have to change the numbers or signs, whatever you prefer, and then instead of an or boolean, it should be an and boolean, followed by another and boolean. You'll see in a bit. Now that everything is working fine, we can move on to creating the animation montage. We're going to have to create another function in order for the motion warping to know where the character has to go. To use the motion warping plugin, we're going to have to add the motion warping component into the third person character blueprint. The warp target name will be a name that will be the same here and when we create the animation montage also. Has to be exactly spelled the same. And to know what the warp target location is, we're going to use the variables we promoted before. So the object height and the object depth. Depending on the animation, you might have to change the alpha for this a bit, or if it's a completely different thing, you might only be interested in the object height or the object depth. So this is up to you, this number, or the location you want to give it. We also don't want to change the rotation of the target, so we're going to get the get actor rotation and just plug it in. The next thing we need to create is a custom event. This event will change the movement mode as well as the collision of the character, since in order to be able to do the motion warping we have to be flying and the collision of the capsule component needs to be turned off. After this we're going to get the mesh and create the play montage. On completed or when interrupted, we want to set the vaulting variable back to false, since we've already finished the action. On notify begin, which we will later put in the actual montage, we want to reset the collision and the movement mode. Now we're going to create the anim montage from the animation we made. Here we want to add two notify tracks. In one of them we will put the motion warping notify, and in the other one the montage notify. Warp target name needs to be the same in the montage as in the function. We want to disable ignore set axis and warp rotation, and I just like to put the circular out in the mode. The blend in and blend out are also up to you, how you want to do it, how much time it's going to blend in and how much time it's going to blend out, but I think leaving it default works good in this case. So when setting the motion warping notify, you basically have to extend the notify and give the character the window in which he's going to move from the position he is at the moment to the position we established in the motion warping function we did. In my case, I'm setting the last point of the notify when the hand should be placed on top of the obstacle. And I want the character to reset its collision and movement mode approximately at frame 45. In the motion warping function, we're also going to have to add the vault custom event we created in the event graph. As you can see, the animation plays, the location is off, so we're going to have to change that, and the feet are not playing the animation, which has to do with the IK control rig the mannequin has by default. To fix this, we're going to have to go into the animation blueprint and directly disconnect the control rig so it no longer does the IK, which is one solution. As you can see now, the animation plays correctly even though the position is off. Or we're going to have to create a variable inside the animation blueprint so that the character doesn't do the IK trace when we're vaulting. So within the animation blueprint, we want to cast to our character, in this case third person character, promote it to a variable, and that way we'll have access to the vaulting variable we have inside our third person character blueprint. Now that we have the variable BP third person character, we can get the vaulting and then promote it to a variable within this blueprint. Here I previously made a mistake. It's not get play pawn, it's get only an actor. We do a select float and we use the vaulting variable to choose between 0 and 1. So now we can conserve still the IK, but it won't do it while we're doing the animation. Next thing we need to correct is the warp target location. Since we're going way above it, we're going to have to subtract a number from the Z axis. This is another problem I came across. The camera is just clipping through when I do the animation. I found several solutions. I found two solutions. One of them is to disable the do collision test. Another one would be to put the camera boom as a child of the mesh and use one of the bones like head, neck 1, spine 1 or others as the parent of the camera boom. I also want to retouch a bit the window of opportunity the motion warping has, since I think I extended it for too long, so I'm going to reduce it a bit. To avoid the bug you just saw on screen, you have to add a tag to that actor and then make the character ignore any actor with that tag, or increase the height of the capsule trace. In my case, I'm gonna ignore all actors with tag, and the spelling has to be the same as the tag. And now we shouldn't have that problem anymore. At this point, you can do any adjustments you want for it to look better. Now we have to put a branch where we check if we are vaulting, and if we're not vaulting, we're going to attach the jump node. Another thing we need to finish is adding the variables for when the character detects an object above its head. We want to create another condition and create another Boolean variable. If it is true and we hit something, we're going to set it to true. And if it's false, we're going to set it to false. And both of these will break the for loop we did at the beginning. And that's about it. This is the system my game is using for most of the animations. Let me know what you think, and if you found it useful or enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.